So one person who has taken this model very seriously, perhaps not not randomly, is a student, a former MIT student who it's called Ji Bai. She's now at the Kennedy School, and she has several papers on reputation, including one on tinted milk in China that I'm not going to cover today, and her job market paper, which had the nice title "Melons as Lemons," which was on this idea of, which was really on how difficult it is to build a reputation. So what she did is that she, being a graduate student, couldn't run a very expensive experiment, so she ran a very cheap experiment in China, and she went to a market, and in markets you have like home markets around neighborhood markets, where one of the things that is being sold is watermelons. Chinese really like watermelons, and watermelons differ in quality. In particular, the sweeter the better. And it turns out that there is considerable asymmetric information between sellers and buyers. The sellers, you would think it's pretty hard to know whether a watermelon is sweet or not, but sellers actually have more information on whether their melons are good than the buyer. They are able to sort them. If you ask a seller to take this pile of watermelon and to make a pile of good ones and a pile of bad ones, the good ones are better than the bad ones. So they know, maybe from where they got them, maybe from the appearance, you can talk on them and see their. So they have a number of things that the buyer doesn't know, so they know whether they have, so there is asymmetric information. So what she did is to offer two technologies to market, to people in the market, to certify, quote unquote, the good quality melons. So they asked them to sort them in piles for the sellers, to offer different prices, or they suggested to sort them in piles and offer different prices for the high quality melons and the low quality melons. Yeah.
And the seller, I'm not going to say decide whether or not I try to score if they are.
Well, that's the whole point. The whole point is to say that. So the idea is that if you could, so give me a minute, it'll be simpler. So basically the seller, she offers two technology to certify, quote unquote, the high quality melons. Either sticker, so you say it's a sticker that say high quality melon, or a laser print, which once you've done it, you cannot counterfeit, you cannot shift them. So basically, they sorted, the sellers would sort the melons in front of the person, and then would say, so these are the sticker melon or the laser melon and the regular quality. So premium versus regular quality, and offer whatever difference in price they were interested to offer. And the key, the reason why it's interesting is that the stickers, once the guy is gone and you finished your sort, you can resort them. So the sticker is not a good certification method because it's easily counterfeitable. Okay, whether the laser, once you've lasered your melon, they are lasered. And then in order to look at whether what would happen to customers, how customers would update if melons were sorted under two strategies, she also offered a short-term incentive to sort accurately. So the short-term incentive is not meant to be something that would last, because after all, if sellers don't find it in interest to do them, then but you can see what happens if people do that, if you do that for some period of time. So first, what they look is that, so if you look at the difference, basically, is saying how sweet is so the quality is sweetness. So the way they measure the quality is that they took some melons from both piles and they measured the sweetness. It's not someone who tasted it. It's like you can put a probe in them and you can know the sweetness. So in the non-incentive group, the people who got the quality of the premium pile, so the quality of the pile that's supposed to be high quality, is much higher in the laser group than in the sticker group. In the incentive pile, it is also higher, but not as much higher. The differential part is lower. So the incentive did incentivize them to do the sorting more properly and to keep it more properly. But you can do it the other way. That's the same data presented the other way. In the laser group, the incentive has an effect on how well you sort. But in the sticker group, it's even higher. So in the sticker group, they have more reason to, in the laser group, they have more reason to sort even without the incentive. Presumably because buyers can learn the quality more effectively. Then you can look at also the difference between, this is the same operation, difference between premium and regular. The premium pile is more as a larger difference in quality in the laser group than in the sticker group, in the non-incentive group. Now, what does it do to customers? So while this was going on, like for a few weeks this was going on, they either had their laser or their stickers and they either had incentive or no incentive. They went and looked at what the clients did. And in particular, whether they could charge for a higher price difference in the laser group than in the sticker group. And you can see that in the laser group, the difference, so the quality difference was higher, and the price difference is also higher than in the sticker group. This is compared to, this is the group that don't get incentive, so forget the incentive. This is compared to a group that does nothing. So the premium pile has a higher, the premium pile has a higher price difference in the laser group than in the sticker group. So basically, the sellers internalize the fact that the buyer is understanding that their grading is not that reliable in the case of the stickers. And then you can look at what it does to profit to have access to this technology. And basically, the sticker did nothing to their profits. So the lasers help them differentiating, and through the differentiation get a higher price for the high quality and therefore make more money. But the stickers didn't do anything to them. So then what she does, and I'm not going to spend, then what she does is that she removes the incentive and then see whether people continue to sort after so in the group that get the incentive initially, she sees whether people continue to sort and sort well after they get the incentive. And in the laser group, they continued. So probably they needed the incentive, when they got the incentive that helped them kickstart their process. But then they realized that they were making more money, even irrespective of the incentive, when they were sorting well with the laser. So they continued to do it even after the incentive was removed. In the sticker price, while they had the incentive, they provided more quality, but this sorting went down like dramatically the moment that the incentive was removed. And the reason could be that they saw that there was no value in providing, in really sorting. There is no value, they had the incentive, but other than the incentive, there had no particular value in providing the high quality in the sticker group because the customer didn't really believe them anyway. And therefore they weren't willing to pay them a much higher price for the sticker group, so why would they continue? They can just go back to the undifferentiated pile and not make the effort of sorting.
But here, you have the fixed price for high quality and sticker water but you don't consider the bargaining power of the product because of the sticker maybe. In China, they always have that bargain.
So this is the final price, so that's what people end up paying.
Okay.
This is not the. So it's exactly right. Like basically, even if they offer a higher sticker price, so to speak, when there is the sticker, the client is just not willing to pay that, and they bargain them down. So the price differentiation that you can get if it's just you saying it is not high enough to justify the effort that it is to sort them. So there is information that they have, and that's not revealed. So it's inefficient, because since they have the information, it would be better to reveal it so that people who want high quality more can pay more for it, and people who prefer average quality can pay less. But that information is not revealed because they have no way to convey it satisfactorily to the client. Whereas in the case of the laser technology, since that's much more difficult to counterfeit, they sort of believe in that the client believe that the ranking is real, so to speak. They are willing to pay a premium, and therefore it's worth continuing. So what they do then, what she does then is to use this data, that part I'm not going to cover here, is that she uses this data to estimate a model of how quickly customers update, and therefore what's the rational behavior for a seller. And what she concludes is that, so under sticker, consumers essentially don't update, so that's not worth it to self-certify, even though it's a very low cost to do it in the morning. It's not even worth that very low cost. Under laser, they do update, so that is worth it. But the difference in profit from going through that effort is not worth the cost of the laser, which is itself expensive. So you would need to, the fixed cost of the laser would be too high, and so there is no, even the difference in prices doesn't make it worth it, which would sort of open the space for public policy that kind of create, or public policy here could be sellers of, the Watermelon Sellers Association could help the quality information provision by offering that service of certification in the first place.
Would have been interesting to see that it's really about certifiability or about reputation of the seller, that if the seller had certifiable laser mount melons, and the customers, they believe that they taste better, and then he switches to stickers, and then the stickers might work because they build up trust between sellers and them.
Yeah,
because this is not really about reputation, it's just about, do I believe the signal that the...
Yes, it's about how quickly are you willing to update. But it is still about reputation, because it is a collective reputation that sellers will extract the maximum short-run gain if they have a chance. So there could be another equilibrium in this market where there is a reputation for trustworthy discrimination between good and bad, and you would, and then people would do it. So in that sense, it's about reputation, although it's more about collective reputation than individual reputation. And what you're asking is that, could I build my individual reputation by a stint of laser divided things followed by stickers? That's a good question. I don't know, either in theory or in practice. It's not something she did, so. So here is another reputation paper that Abhijit and I did many years ago then. That was part of my dissertation, actually, which is to look at where we were interested in reputation in one sector, which is the software industry. And the software industry is an interesting sector because there was a huge boom in the software industry in India. I think collectively, India is perceived as having all these good engineers, etc. So it has a good general collective reputation. And software is, especially the type of software that Indian firms produced at the time, still largely produce, is this customized software, very specific to a particular firm. It's not very high tech. So you want an accounting system. So, for example, they could customize a SAP platform for you, or they could start from scratch and write and prepare something for you. So that's mostly what they do. So, customized software project, few months, nothing high tech. It takes time to produce. The problem with software, and that's really like the fundamental problem of software engineering that you read in software engineering book, if you find it, that it's very difficult to know how long it's gonna take until you actually do it. Because the buyer doesn't know what they want until they see it, really. So you do a first thing and then the buyer is like, no, that doesn't really correspond to my specification, so you do more things in order to get to where they wanted. So the project always overrun. They still call it overrun, but almost all projects have overrun. Because from the initial code that is given is the minimum to get a first thing, and it's very, very rarely the first thing that you actually want. Okay. So that's what software firms do, and as in the model above, there is heterogeneity in the type of firms, and bad firms will do cost overruns. But the actual overrun that you observe in a project could be a combination of the firm being too slow or the clients wanting more things. So the big dispute, the questions that always arise in a software project is whether who is paying for the overrun. So if the overrun comes from you saying that, no, you gave me a blue accounting system, but I wanted a purple one, so then you change to purple, that costs some time. That's not because it's not that the software firm was bad. Unless you actually did purple and they misunderstood, and in that case they were bad. So that's kind of the reputation is over. Are you good or bad at at understanding what the client wants, producing the best under these conditions? The contracts provide inadequate production because both sides can claim that the other side was to blame for delays. So you can always say, once you have overrun, it's impossible for a court to adjudicate what fraction of the overhead is due to the software firm being slow or misunderstanding the request versus the client not specifying the request precisely enough. So there is no way that a judge is going to be able to adjudicate between those disputes. Usually, in fact, they actually throw these disputes out. They don't even... So there are two ways to deal with cost overrun. You could just, for the buyer, you could just kick them out. Or you could force the firms to pay for it by making them responsible for the overrun. So then what you do is you have a fixed cost contract, say, create my accounting system, I'm going to give you $15,000 for it. And that's it. That's the contract. So that's called a fixed cost contract. But the problem of a fixed cost contract is twofold. Number one, it creates incentives for the buyer to not being very serious in what they want or change their mind, etc., because they've already paid for it. And it gives the buyer, and in addition, the buyer are usually large firms in the US, and the sellers are small firms in India. So the buyer could actually, for them it's small change, and for them the same amount of money is small change, whereas a seller could go bankrupt if they have too many costs. So the efficient thing would really be a time and material contract, but you don't want to do that because as a buyer, because you don't want to, you don't know whether the firms that you are dealing with is a good firm or a bad firm that is going to have all these overruns that are not specified. Therefore, and because there is this difference in how valuable the time and material contract is for a small Indian firm versus a large US buyers, eventually the firms will prefer to move to a time and material contract, and the buyer will only agree if the firm has a reputation for being good. So what are the predictions of this? So first is that if you establish a reputation with a single relationship with a single seller, you're more likely to move to a time and material contract. So this is the equivalent of, the fixed cost contract is the equivalent of, in the Tirol model as offering you the red at 0. It's basically forcing you to take a loss to prove that you're the good guys. So you start with a fixed cost material, and then maybe you move after some time. That's one implication. Another implication is a lot of these contracts of these firms are actually have a close relationship with the parent company in the US. So, for example, or in Europe. So, for example, British Airways will have British Airways software firms in India. That's not part of British Airways exactly. They could even work for other groups as well. But there is, of course, an understanding that they will continue working with them continuously. So in that case, you have a long-term relationship almost inscribed in the name. So there again, because there is a long-term relationship, the time and material contract might be more likely to happen. And then finally, assuming that the bad firms which do not get repeat buyers and eventually they get out of business, then the older firms are the ones who have not died yet, are more likely to be good firms. So just by being around for a longer time, being an older firms, you get a time. You're more likely to get a time and material contract. So those are the three things that we can test. I'm going to show them show the tables to you in a minute, but you can see the implication. The implication is that the need to create a reputation creates a barrier to entry that's financial, and therefore a fixed cost of entering the software industry, despite the fact that software is basically you need nothing to create a software industry physically. You need one PC and one person, or 10 PC and 10 people. So there is no fixed cost to start in software. And yet, if you're looking at software, even at the time, all the big industrial group like Tata started a software company. Hindustan Lever started a software company. So all the big industrial groups started software company. And those software companies were more likely to stick around and be successful. And so basically, initially it can be a bit surprising that why would the industrial group, have an advantage in a sector where there is no fixed cost relative to someone else. And one of the ones is that, first of all, they could have a reputation for quality. And even if not, they have deep pocket, so they can survive the time it's going to take and the losses it's going to take to have a deep pocket. So the sector was much more dominated by firms with large piles of cash than you would have expected for a sector where, in principle, anybody in their garage can start Microsoft or Apple. That doesn't mean that there is no people who started from scratch. Infosys, for example, is a key example of 9 IIT engineers who started their firm and became huge. But then the other big one, for example, is Wipro, which was started by Asim Premji. And Wipro was initially a sunflower oil company. So it's not that the sunflower oil gave them a reputation for being good at software, but basically they had time to buy. That time they had enough money to buy time, and time is reputation. So now let's look at these three implications. So what I did is to run around when I was graduate school, hire a driver. I don't think you could do that in Bangalore anymore, because now to go to Bangalore from point A to point B in Bangalore takes 5 hours. But at the time it was a little smaller. So I just was going from place to place and calling them before and saying, "Hi, I'm from MIT. I'm doing a study on the software industry. Can I meet your CEO?" And also, I don't know if you could do that today, but maybe you could still. MIT carries some weight in that world. And then I asked them some questions about their last couple of projects, their last 2 projects, in particular, the last 2 completed projects. So in particular, what type of contracts they got, how long was the contract for, how much was the overrun, and who ended up paying for it. So very simple. So first thing we can do is estimate an ordered profit where you go. 1 is fixed cost, 2 is time and is mixed, which you can do. You can do a time and material for the first phase, that's the specification phase, and then fixed cost for implementation, or you can go to full time and material. And then you can do the same thing for whether the firms pay for the overrun, whether there was an overrun. So here is for the choice of contract. You can see that young firms are more likely to get lousy contract, are more likely to get fixed cost contract compared to the best one, which is time and material. On repeated contract, that's not significant, but it goes the other way. ISO certification doesn't seem to help. This idea is that in certification contract you could try, but ISO certification seems to be doing nothing. Internal projects, which are the projects that you're doing for your parent company, are much more likely to be on time and material. So age is bad and internal project is bad. Then how much you end up actually paying, either unconditional, or conditional on the contract. So unconditional, you have that the young firm end up paying about 15% more of the overrun than the older firm. The repeated contract end up paying 17% less of the overrun, and the internal project end up paying 25% less of the overrun. So that means that the younger you are, the more you have to pay for mistakes that are not necessarily yours. And that's true. So part of it is due to the contract, and part of it even happens conditional on the contract, which is even conditional on fixed cost contract renegotiation to the advantage of the firm is more likely to happen for older firm and in repeated contracts. Now, is it because the firms are worse in a way? And it doesn't seem to be the case. When you're looking at the overrun, seem to be completely unrelated to the type of firms. The overrun due to the firm, the share of the overrun that is due to the firm, now as reported by the firm, so of course that might be misleading, is also not related to the firm. The delay is not related to the characteristic of the firm. On the other hand, the young firm get a simpler project, and they get much more likely to do this Y2K project. So I did this data collection just before the year 2000. That dates me, I suppose. So there were a lot engaged into doing this. There was this fear, probably don't remember, that before 2000, a lot of the dates were written as two digits, like 72, 75, 99. And then suddenly in 2000, there could be this enormous confusion because computer wouldn't know whether 00 is 2000 or whether 00 is 1900. So they had to go to, so basically all the firms engaged into this massive combing of all their line of codes to hunt for instances where the date was specified as a 2-digit and fix that. That's not high quality, it's not hard to do and not very interesting. And so the young firm gets Y2K projects that are very simple, and they get simple projects. That's another way. Their own rating of whether it was an easy project or a complex project is lower. So that might be partly because that's what the client trusts them with, but it's also partly because that's the things that they feel comfortable taking on, knowing that with a complex project, overrun is more likely and they'll end up paying for it. I only have 10 minutes left, so I think I'm going to skip the flowers, but you have them, it's a nice paper, you have them in the slides, so I want to make sure that I have some time talking about networks, and a couple of papers on networks. And I'm going to skip Greif as well. So until a while, for a while, there was not too much work on networks, and there were these 2 papers by Avner Greif, which is very nice, on the Maghribi trader that we kept kind of recycling and quoting. The idea of paper number 1 is that Maghribi traders had a very good X, very high X. So you couldn't default on one Maghribi trade. If you were a Maghribi trader, you couldn't default on a trading partner because everybody would come to know. And that allowed them to be, to sustain a long-distance trading relationship with very high-value shipments, despite the fact that there was no formal institution and contract and stuff like that. In contrast to the Genovese traders, where nobody trusted anybody, there was no network effect, and therefore they didn't benefit from that. So paper 1 is that. and how the Maghrebi trader, in a static kind of a way, did much better than the trader in Genoa, because they had this deep social network and were able to convey information. Paper 2 is to say, well, but in the long run, that really screwed the Maghrebi trader, because since the Genoese trader didn't have so much social capital, they had to create formal institutions to substitute for their lack of informal institution. But then the formal institution ended up being much more resilient in the face of changes. So when the Maghrebi, over time, there was changes, the social fabric started to fray, and the network just collapsed on itself. Whereas in Genoa, where they had these courts and contracts and stuff like that, they could continue and flourish, and eventually they became big. So those are two nice papers. But in recent years, we now have much more recent paper on actually the value of networks for firms in developing countries. And I'll briefly mention a couple of those. The first one is by the same authors that did the politician paper with the bank in Pakistan, if you remember, that we saw in the credit. So using the same data, which is basically the board of directors of all the publicly traded firms, they can look at the benefit of being in a network. So what they do is that they have this board of directors of all the Pakistani companies, publicly traded or private, as long as they borrow from the State Bank of Pakistan. They define, as long as they borrow and therefore are their data anywhere in the State Bank of Pakistan. They define two firms are connected if they share a common director, and two firms are in the same network if they can be linked through connected firms. And since they have the entire universe of firms, they can construct network for the whole economy. And they find, so let's just give you an example of what it means to be connected. So these are the identity of the board member, 1, 2, 3. So these two are connected. They have an edge. These two nodes have an edge. And then they belong to the same network as 5, 6 because A is connected to C, which is connected to D. So that's a network. That's isolated firms. That's another smaller network. And what they find, that's the US. Where is Pakistan? There is Pakistan. What they find is this, which is there is a giant component of the network, which is about 60% of the firm and something like, 5% of the firm, but 60% of the credit is accounted for firms in that giant component. That's not unique to Pakistan. You can see here a giant component also in the US, a giant component in the UK, a giant component in India. That seems to be a feature of firm networks in developing countries. So their question is, what's the value in being in this giant component? That's the question they want to ask. So the first thing they can do is compare a firm in a super network versus one that's not in a super network. What would be so if they find a positive effect on loans, sales, profits, etc., being a super network, what could be a sign of bias? What could be a potential problem? What could be the... Yeah.
Entry into the network is conditional on your past personal performance.
Yeah, it could be that the firms who belong to the giant component are generally, for example, a very simple mechanical thing. Maybe they have more board members. Maybe you have more board members because you are bigger, or because even if I conditional sales, you need them. You are operating in more markets, etc. So you would be more likely to have. So better firms could be more likely to be in the network, in the giant component of the network. Then you do the same, but with firm fixed effect. So this is over time. They have several repeat of the data. So where does the variation come from if they do it with firm fixed effect?
There's a critical member of the board that goes out or in the board?
Yes, so it could be that exactly. It could be that either you're losing a director, so you disappear from the giant component, or because that was the director that was tying you to the network, or you're adding a network, board member that happens to be tied to the. So maybe that's a little better, but could there still be issues with that? If I look at as you are suddenly adding a new, say, let's take you're adding a new network member that is connected to another firm that puts you in the giant network, and I find you're doing better. Yeah.
Well, it's not that you are better because you're in the network. It's you're in the network because you're better.
Exactly. Like you got, for example, you got this new big contract and you feel like, oh, I better get a new board member who is specialist in this area. So I got a new big contract in software, and I used to produce potatoes. Let me get a new board member who does software that's gonna connect you to the giant component. Vice versa. You're reducing your activity because things are doing very poorly, your board shrinks, you leave the giant component, that might be the reason. So that's also not perfect. So their final idea is to use incidental firm entry and exit from the super network. So that's another way in which you enter and exit. Is not necessarily that one of your board members arrived or left to connect you to the giant network. That's one source of variation. But the other thing that might kick you out of the giant component is that the firm that you are connected with, they lose their access to the giant component. So suppose that I'm only connected to the giant component via one other firm. This other firm is itself connected to the giant component via one director, and that director lives at the other firm. Then suddenly, I used to be in giant component, but I'm not anymore. So that's incidental entry. Yeah.
But so the effect would only be estimated on firms that are at the margin and that are connected to the huge network only through end-to-end.
Exactly. So that's one issue, which is basically we are now looking at so it might not be a bias issue, it might more be an interpretation of the effect, but it is a very important one, which is we are looking at the value of being in super network on people who are, fragilely connected to where there is a chance that something happening elsewhere kicks them out. So that's the problem with that. That's the problem with that strategy. Another problem, which is more even on the internal validity, not just the interpretation, is that the fact that your partner that you share a board member with suddenly loses a board of director might mean that they are in trouble, and if they are in trouble and you share a board member, perhaps you have a lot of relationship with them as well, and you are in trouble because they are in trouble. If you had a board member from that firm because you traded a lot with them and they suddenly lose their market, then that's going to affect you by ripple effect. And of course, you cannot, this might seem a little bit far-fetched, but it's not far-fetched. If we're talking about networks, we have to assume that things that happen in the network might affect other firms. So here is an example of all of that. So the direct entrants are in white. For example, here, first you were not in a giant network, and then you join it. And then the incidental entrance is in yellow. This firm joined the giant component, and therefore this firm that's connected to it joins the giant component. Okay, so this is to say that I'm done. So this is, yes. So this is the basic OLS, where you show that, for example, this is on borrowing. So firms that are in a giant component can borrow more. This is using. I'm looking for the one with fixed effect. So I'm not finding the fixed effect. So that's now looking at, this is with direct entrance versus, so this is interacting with, no, sorry, this is all fixed effect actually. So this is all with form fixed effect. So this is the second strategy of you've joined. So all of this is about 16 to 19% more credit. And now we can look at whether this is the difference between direct entrance, which is this plus this. So if you enter yourself, your gross in credit is 13 plus 13, 26. And half of that is also the incidental entrance benefit from about half of that. So that's still a lot. And then we can look at the your question that you were asking, which is the very marginal people are more likely to lose their access than the more central people. One way in which you can capture marginality is what they call Google rank, what's more conventionally called eigenvector centrality in network theory, but it's a measure of how you're important when you're connected to people who are themselves important. So they call it Google rank. In the Google page, the pages that go up are pages that are cited by pages that are themselves cited a lot. So it's a recursive measure of importance in the network. And you can see that you can look at the interaction between your entrance and your importance once you're in and your importance once you're out. And you get larger effect when you're an important firm when you're not. You're less likely to default on your loan if you're in the network. So that means that part of the benefit is that you might get help if there is an issue on your loan. You're getting larger loan, you have more creditor, you're less reliant on the government banks, you get more loan from the credit bank, and you are in particular getting more credit from your new friends that were made in the networks. So that suggests that the network provides kind of testimonial, etc., that can help you in accessing competitive sources. So it's a very different mechanism than the political mechanism we saw in their other paper, which was all driven by the government bank. So it's about relationship, but in a sense about bad relationship, where this is about like business relationship and support. So I don't have time to cover this paper, and it's a really nice paper, so I'll cover it at the beginning of next time. You can look at it maybe before. It's a paper by Jing Kai and Adam Zeidel, where they actually have a randomized experiment in creating networks between firms. So that's kind of the frontier in that is, if RCTs are fashionable and networks are fashionable and firms are fashionable, then the experiment on firms on network is in the KIPGE, obviously.